I'm Jules Cobb. I'm a Don Farm Youth and Family Services therapist, and I co-present this series with Ray Dalton, who coordinates the Don Farm outpatient services. This slidecast is a presentation of part 2 of the 2-part What Teens Use and Drugs, What to Know and What to Do series. We will discuss ways to respond helpfully when a young person may be involved with substances, and there will be a video at the end showing a young person in recovery from a substance use disorder sharing their personal recovery story. There is also a slidecast for part 1 in this series, which discusses the effects of substance use on adolescents and how to recognize when a young person may be harmfully involved with substances.
Okay, so we are all here for Teens Using Drugs Part 2, what to do. So last week was what to know, this week's what to do. Hopefully I'm going to give you some more kind of practical, tangible things you can do in regards to your teenager if you feel like they're struggling with some substance problem. I also happy to make this more of a dialogue than just talking at you. So if you have any questions at any point in time, just go ahead and holler them out at me, and it's probably a lot better to have a dialogue than to just hear me talk at you. So this is a slide. So we're here for a prevention program. So there's one sure way to be 100% certain that your child is never going to have a problem with alcohol or drugs. Anybody have a guess of what that 100% certain way is?
We've seen this one before.
Yeah. Don't have kids, right? So, because what we're at is a prevention program, and prevention programs are really effective in preventing and reducing substance use for folks. But there's really no prevention program that can 100% guarantee that teenagers at some point won't at least try alcohol and drugs. And some of those folks who have a genetic predisposition towards addiction maybe start using more often, and eventually it leads to and progresses to chemical dependency. I oftentimes say that this, a lot of the folks that are in our services right now who maybe are coming into our services at 25 and 30 years old, they started out in the same boxes of beer and the same bottles of wine and the same baggies of weed as a lot of their peers did. Some of them just had a genetic predisposition towards alcohol and drug addiction. They started to use drugs, started using more variety of drugs, found a particular drug that they might have really liked, and it progressed to chemical dependency, and really, as we'll talk about here in a few slides, the fabric of their lives started to unravel. All right, so last week we went through this. I'll go through this really quickly because it sounds like some of the folks were not here previously. So use is about social use. Again, the big piece of this is minimal and often infrequent. Misuse means that you're taking more than the recommended guidelines. You're overusing a substance. Oftentimes when we talk about alcohol, the overuse means binge drinking. Abuse means you're using illegally, using for alternate reasons. So it might be prescribed to you for one reason, but you're really using it for stress, etc. And then you start to see consequences appear. And then dependency, the big piece is you're using larger amounts over a longer period of time. You're starting to become maybe physically dependent on it, depending on the substance, and you keep using despite consequences, right? Now, one of the things we talked about is that the early stages of dependence look a lot like misuse and abuse, so it's really hard to divide what is misuse, abuse, and what is ultimately dependence, right? And so we're going to give you some kind of tricks to be able to figure that stuff out tonight, okay? Before we do that, though, I want to talk about teens, the Monitoring the Future study. These are the 2017 numbers. I'm going to throw some 2018 numbers out at you as well. But real quickly, the Monitoring the Future survey is a survey of 8th, 10th, and 12th graders that's conducted by the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. and it's under the grant for the National Institute of Drug Abuse, which is the NIDA, and it's been going on since 1975. So 43,000 students from across 360 public and private schools participated in this survey in 2017. And again, it's 8th, 10th, and 12th graders that they survey. And these surveys are anonymous. They get really good data out of this, data that I really believe in. So a couple of things to kind of, we show this slide because there's about 24%, back in 1997, daily use of cigarettes amongst 12th graders was almost 25%. So 25% of 12th graders were smoking daily back in 1997. You know, cut to 20 years later, and that number's down to 4.2%. Now, I know, you know, probably on a lot of people's TV screens, on a lot of, you know, I mean, even you go onto YouTube or any of digital sites, you see a lot of targeted interventions for smoking nowadays. At least I do. And you see a lot of interventions in regards to literature being put out there, education that's being put out there in regards to cigarette smoking. And you can see the dramatic decline that has happened because of that. And so this is an area where prevention really, really works well, right? And so it you know, when we look at the when we look at a slide a little bit further down the road, you know, you can see between 2002 and 2017 the dramatic drop in Vicodin misuse amongst 12th graders as well, right? So again, really targeted intervention and prevention efforts have been you know, a big deal in a steady decline. Education of also doctors prescribing this, tightening regulations, you know, all things that we're doing with cigarette smokers over this course of time is leading to these really, really great drops. On the flip side, you can see kind of a steady incline in regards to daily marijuana smoke amongst 12th graders from 92 to about 2017. So we were down to about 2% in 92, and that's up to about 6% here in 2017. Other kind of drug trends, you can see that in regards to prescription or over-the-counter medications, the leading prescription misuse is amongst stimulants. So Adderall at 5.5 and Ritalin about 13.37. So, you know, just about 7% of folks who are misusing prescription drugs are misusing stimulants. Amongst illicit drugs, the past year misuse amongst 12th graders is about 37% for marijuana, add another 3%, so that's about 40% for overall cannabinoids, and then you can see LSD, cocaine, MDMA, inhalants, and heroin down here. So I also want to, I think there's a big misnomer that everybody's doing it as well, and that's just not the case. So I want to read off some quick statistics from the Monitoring the Future of 2018. So lifetime use of lifetime use of alcohol amongst 8th, 10th, and 12th graders, about 41% said they'd ever drink alcohol. So that's another 59% of all 8th, 10th, and 12th graders saying they've never drank anything, right? About 25% reported being drunk in their lifetime. So again, 75% of 8th, 10th, and 12th graders that were surveyed in 2018 never have been drunk. 30% said they'd used cannabis. So again, 70% of all 8th, 10th, and 12th graders had never used marijuana. And then when you kind of, when you start to focus it down a little bit more in the last 30 days, about 14% had said they used any marijuana in the last 30 days. So again, another 86% had not used marijuana in the last 30 days. 18% said they'd drink at all, and 9% had been drunk in the last 30 days. And then when you focus down even a little bit more, daily use, only 3% of 8th, 10th, and 12th graders who were surveyed had used marijuana daily. So, I mean, you're talking about real outliers when we talk about daily use of marijuana. There is not a lot of 8th, 10th, and 12th graders that are using daily. So, not this idea that everybody's using it. It's, maybe there's a proximity bias when it comes to youth saying, hey, yeah, all my friends, everybody I know is using all the time. That's just not what the actual numbers are bearing out. Okay, so what to do if you are concerned that your loved one is struggling with a substance use disorder. The first thing to know is that poor parenting doesn't cause addiction. Poor parenting doesn't cause a problem with drugs and alcohol. And it cannot necessarily be prevented by good parenting. And, as the slide states down here, previously successful parenting skills really stop working when a person starts using drugs and alcohol. And there's a whole new skill set that needs to be learned. We talked a lot last week about addiction is not a rational illness. And when you try to treat it as such, it starts to cause sometimes even more problems, all right? So it's important to understand that none of us are perfect. And it's important to turn your focus more on how to help the person versus trying to figure out who's to blame or what moves could I have done better or what could I have done differently or what should I have done to be able to recognize this earlier, right? And know that addiction is a disease. Unfortunately, it's the only disease that you get yelled at for having, but it is a disease, and we really need to treat it more like what it is. And there are some things that we can do to help. I think the first and the most important is to evaluate your own use of substances and your own attitudes and values towards substance use. Anybody old enough to remember that 1980s commercial where the kid is sitting on the bed and he's listening to like some heavy metal music with those styrofoam kind of earphones, and he's like just playing the drums, and the dad walks in with this like box of drugs and he shoves it in the kid's face and he starts yelling at the kid like, I found these, where'd you learn how to use these, where did you learn how to use these? And the kid looks all startled and he takes off his headphones. And he sits back and he looks at his dad and he screams back, I learned it by watching you, Dad. Anybody remember this commercial? Nobody? One or two? Couple of people shaking their heads. Yeah, I mean, so it's a goofy 80s commercial, but there's a lot of truth to that, right? So, kids pick up on what we do, right? We, as much as we want to say, do as I say, not as I do, we model what, we model a lot of things in our lives, good or bad for our kids. So it's really important to evaluate your own use of substances, your own attitudes, your own behaviors in regards to substances. Are you using, to be able to, get rid of stress? Are you, it's hard to if you're smoking pot or if you're drinking in front of your children, it's hard sometimes to say, don't do this thing, right, that I'm doing. So it's important to work with your spouse, your partner, your family member. Addiction is a lot like a fungi. It grows in the dark. It progresses in the dark. And I think, there's a lot of stigma when it comes to substance use disorders. There's a lot of stigma when it comes to addiction. And we don't necessarily want to talk about our teenagers struggling with addiction because we think it looks poorly on us, it looks poorly on them. And so we don't talk about it with other people. And so then what ends up happening is, folks don't know to maybe not give money to your child, not to, to make sure that, prescription pills are being accounted for. And so access to drugs and access to the things that will garner drugs becomes a little bit easier for the person who's struggling with the substance use disorder. it's really important to utilize consistency, confrontation, and consequences. We're going to talk a little bit more about this here in the coming slide, specifically like kind of the confronting what I find when I find it, being consistent in my in the rules and the consequences are going to be a big piece of this. Now, one of the things that I said earlier is that continued use despite consequences is a big piece of what is chemical dependency. And I will say that consequences don't necessarily get a person to stop, but it might be enough to get them to their first counseling session, that first assessment, that first AA meeting, the first therapy appointment. So consequences can be helpful, just not in the kind of way that we traditionally think so. It's really important to avoid guilt, shame, and blame. I think a lot of people, I don't know anybody who gets into recovery or gets sober because of guilt, shame, and blame. That's something they have a lot of and tends to actually kind of propel use. So I think it's more important to treat with hope than it is, more guilt, more shame in regards to their substance use. And it's really important to get professional help, both for yourself and for your loved one. Any questions so far? Okay. Okay, this is the important piece here in regards to being able to figure out, okay, what is abuse and what is dependence, right? This is the big piece about how do we flush out what is the early signs of dependence and what is really just misuse or abuse. Not just misuse or abuse, but what is misuse or abuse. So I think the first thing that you do if you are trying to figure out whether or not this is misuse, abuse, or addiction is you establish rules and you set down consequences for those rules. So I believe that any day that a teenage brain is sober is a good day, right? So if the household rule is you are not to use any drugs and alcohol, period. You communicate that to them and you want to be very concrete with it. So you don't want to say, hey, you're not to use drugs and alcohol in this house because, what the teenager hears, okay, well, I just want to do it in the house, I'll do it in the garage, I'll do it in the backyard, I'll do it at a friend's house, I'll go to a party and do it, right? So you want to be able to, you want to be very concrete, you want to communicate what the rule is, and you want to make sure you set what the consequence is. And the consequence has to be a consequence that has some weight to it. And you got to be willing to enforce that consequence if the rule is broken. What you want to do then is once you've established the rule, you've set what the consequence is, you want to make sure that you are monitoring the person and the best way that you can monitor whether or not a addiction is present, whether or not substance use is present, is by utilizing drug screens. One thing I will make note of is that not all drug screens are created equally, and not all drug screens are going to catch everything. I mean, we use a 12-panel drug screen, so it looks at 12 different drugs and monitors for those 12 different drugs, but there are many drugs that there are just no screens for. And there are all sorts of ways to be able to try to clean out your system. There are all sorts of ways to, maybe even produce fake urine or put urine, somebody else's urine inside of those drug screens. So you got to make sure it's the actual person's drug screen or urine that's in those drug screens. And know that certain substances are in and out of the system fairly quickly. So you have to, I think it has to be, the way that we do it at Dog Farm is we will say, hey, there is a certain day that you're going to be drug screens for accountability. So you say, I'm going to drug screen you on every Monday, and then we'll throw random ones in there in between as well. Because stimulants are in and out of your system pretty quickly. Opiates can be out of your system pretty quickly. You're not going to find a lot of hallucinogens. Unless you're doing specialty labs, you're not going to be able to catch people using a lot of hallucinogens. There are all sorts of research chemicals out there that they're not going to be good tests for. And so what you do is that you use these drug screens. You'll certainly be able to catch folks if they're using marijuana because it stays in the system much longer. Alcohol, there's no real great tests for that other than there's like dip strips that you can do, something called ETGs. They can be kind of expensive, and they can detect metabolites of alcohol between 24 and 72 hours of last use of alcohol. But anyways, so you want to utilize drug screens. And so what is going to happen is if you set the rules, you enforce the consequences, the person is going to either dramatically decrease their substance use or it's going to disappear altogether. And they might complain and moan and say this isn't fair, but what you're going to, the proof will be in the pudding. You are not going to see positive drug screens. They're not going to be using, right? Because the person who is misusing or abusing the drug, their brains can, recognize that the juice is not worth the squeeze, right? It's not worth me not being on the lacrosse team. It's not worth me not going out for the play. It's not worth me not being able to go to the prom. It's not worth me having my cell phone taken away. It's not worth me not being able to drive, right? And so I'm going to stop using, right? The individuals who are struggling with addiction will continue to use despite those consequences. They'll say, oh, well, I don't really care about my cell phone. Driving's not that important. Or you're going to see them try to use every trick in the book to be able to not get you to detect the fact that they're using the substance, right? So to them, the juice is worth the squeeze, right? The marijuana isn't marijuana, it's survival. Alcohol is not alcohol, it's survival. Cocaine's not cocaine, it's survival, right? Like this is much more important, right, to me than I may be letting on, right? I can't just stop. I have a craving for this substance, right? I lose control once I use it. So we're looking for, again, craving, loss of control, and continued use despite consequences. Those are the three hallmarks for the difference between dependence and abuse. And we get that oftentimes as well at outpatient. I mean, you can't like force somebody to pin them down and extract their urine, right? Like it's just not something you can do, right? And what we do is we consider that a positive test. So we say, okay, that's a positive test. Like otherwise, you wouldn't have anything to, you'd be. And there should be, I think there should also, I think there could be also rewards that are put in this as well. So it doesn't have to also be just nothing but consequences. But, I think the consequences are the stick, but there should be carrots too. Contingency management pieces of things work really well as well. So, hey, if you're doing this, this is the reward, right? And so there's some inherent reward saying, oh yeah, here you go, look it. Everything's great. I'm not smoking marijuana. Everything's fantastic. Let me get this, this treat as well, right? Again, so addiction is not a rational illness. And when we try to treat it as so, sometimes we're going to do the wrong things in regards to the ways that we help. And love sometimes gets in the way of doing what is necessary to successfully help somebody with a drug or alcohol problem. I think about this all the time. Where, I think one of the big things is we want to, especially we want to make sure to protect them from consequences. We want to shield them from suffering, we want to shield them from pain, right? It's just our natural instincts as parents to do so. But I think back to somebody I was working with a long time ago, actually in another state, and they were struggling. There were a young person who was struggling with heroin use, and a police officer pulled them over, and they found paraphernalia, and they found heroin on them, and they were young, and they were the police officer was really, I think, very empathetic towards the young person, didn't arrest them, took them to their home, took them to the parents and said, hey, this is what I found, get them some help, right? And and the person didn't end up getting the help that they needed in regards to residential treatment, which could have maybe been mandated if they had to go to jail or had a probation officer or had some extra accountability pieces of things, and the young person died because of their heroin addiction, and I think the police officer was acting out of a lot of compassion, but I really think that maybe, and maybe not, but maybe if there had been that consequence, maybe things would have turned out a little bit differently. All right. So those who abuse alcohol or drugs will allow the entire fabric of their lives to disintegrate rather than confront that addiction, right? And the reason that is, and we talked a little bit about this last week, but really when you boil down addiction, it is this trick that is played on the brain where, again, the substance is given survival value. And so these are all things that are given survival value: breathing, food, water, sex, sleep, homeostasis. These are all things that we need to survive. And when drugs become another thing that is on that list, it becomes problematic. And the reason why it becomes problematic is because really drugs and alcohol don't really have a satiation point, right? You can breathe enough, you can have enough food, you can have enough water, you can have enough sleep, you can have enough of all of these things, right? And with drugs and alcohol don't have a satiation point. It's like trying to pour, it's like trying to pour into a cup that has no bottom, right? Most people will tell you who struggle with addiction that, they could have had the most drugs, the most alcohol they've ever had. They could be, in a room filled with drugs and alcohol, and already in the back of their mind, there's already this anxiety that's saying, what happens when this is all gone, right? There's already this like tension and anxiety around that, right? And so it's really hard to move up. Anybody know what this pyramid is? Maslow. Yeah, exactly, right? So it's really hard, the idea behind Maslow's, pyramid here is that, you need to be able to have physiological homeostasis. You need to be able to move up to safety. You need to have safety in order to be loved. You need to have, love to feel esteem for yourself. You need to have esteem for yourself before there's some sort of self-actualization. Well, if you can't meet this need, right, how are you ever going to have any of these other things? So this is something called the Johari Window. Anybody remember these at all? Yeah, a couple people. All right. So it sounds all mystical, the Johari Window, but it's really a guy named Joe and Harry who came up with this. So they just like Johari Window. So this is really about how we share information. What information is known to yourself, to others, right? So a psychologically healthy person is very transparent, right? So there is a lot of information that is known to the self and is regularly shared with others, right? And there's some stuff that's known kind of to others, especially when you're a teenager or a young adult. There's a lot of things like, I think parents know sometimes know their children's behaviors, know their children kind of inside and out, and kind of have maybe even a little more insight to them than sometimes they even do. But for the most part, information is pretty freely shared. And this is the profile of a young person with an alcohol or drug problem. So a lot of stuff is just kept to the self. There's a lot of secrecy. There's not a lot of information sharing. I don't know who their friends are. I don't know where they're going. I don't know what happens in their day, right? It's really difficult to get kind of what's going on and a sense of what's going on with the person, right? If you're noticing this, right, especially if there's been a dramatic change from here to here, and some of this stuff is part, we talked about this last week, but it's part of it is growing up, and I'm not going to share everything with my parents anymore. But if it's dramatic, there should be some red flags going off, right? So these are some characteristics that are really helpful when it comes to being able to talk to somebody who is struggling with substance use disorder, struggling with substances. I really think about like the idea of, as I said before, addiction is the only disease that you can get yelled at for having, right? And so I think it's important to have a lot of warmth and empathy towards the young person, and a lot of I like this idea of potency. It's this idea of your word having weight, right? So, and sometimes maybe it's not. Maybe it's not the parent who has the potency. Maybe it's an older brother. Maybe it's a cousin. Maybe it's an aunt. Maybe it's an uncle. Maybe it's a teacher. Maybe it's a counselor. But like, it's really important to get those folks involved in regards to being able to get some help. I will make a note about self-disclosure. I think self-disclosure can be really, really helpful in regards to being able to make sure that you're showing empathy and that you're showing warmth, and saying, hey, when I was younger, I struggled with this as well. I struggled with that as well. I've been through certain circumstances where I understand where you're coming from. I just would be very careful with self-disclosing your own history of substance use. I think that sometimes it can kind of give license to somebody who is using substances as a teenager, and they can say, hey, well, you turned out all right, and you went through this, and you were using when you were 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, and so I think I'll be able to do the same thing. So be careful about self-disclosure. And I think, when we talk about immediacy, I think about making sure, nobody after a long day at work, where, you're dealing with all the hassles of life, wants to immediately come home and get into, a long conversation, an argument, confront what you find when you're finding it. If you see, your kid's eyes look all glassy, or you smell smoke, or you're seeing all these things, rather than dealing with it tomorrow or the next day or the next week, really confronting what you find when you find it, I think is really important. And what you really want to do is when you're confronting, you want to do it with, again, empathy and warmth, but you also want to say, hey, I'm not against you. I'm against your substance use. I'm against some of these behaviors, so that it doesn't become kind of an internalized thing where, again, we're bringing up kind of things like guilt, blame, and shame. Questions about any of this stuff? So these are some defense mechanisms. And when you try to separate somebody who has that survival relationship, who has that that love relationship with a substance, you're going to get some defensive mechanisms that are going to come out. And here's some of the things that you're going to get. And they're really particularly good at being able to get you to back off, right? So you might hear, if you try to when you try to confront the person's substance use, if you get a lot of blaming, oh, it's actually my friends who are doing this. I'm just, if you ever hear, oh, I'm just holding this for my friend, there's never been a case where that's actually the truth, right? Nobody's ever held something for their friend. So if you're seeing a lot of blaming, if you're getting a lot of projection, if you see a lot of manipulation, especially when it comes to like urine screens, or gaslighting. See a lot of rationalizing. Well, it's legal. It comes from the earth. It's on and on and on. If they're minimizing a lot of their use, they're using a lot of humor, or just flat out denying that they're using. And then the biggest one is anger. Right. This is the one that gets people to back away maybe the most. It's very it's a very useful tool in getting somebody to not, not confront a person's substance use. And if you're seeing a lot of these defense mechanisms, the question, that should be popping up in your mind is why? Like, why when I try to intervene on your substance use? Why when we talk about your substance use? Why am I getting all of this pushback, right? And because it doesn't happen with somebody who's just, it's not that big of a deal, right? I'm just experimenting. It's not like you're making too big of a deal out of it. Really? And why am I getting this reaction, right? Okay. So one of the things that, oftentimes I think treatment facilities, I think addiction professionals, I think a lot of people, therapists, I think a lot of people in the community sometimes put a little bit too much emphasis on the importance of internal motivation, right? This idea that you have to want to stop to need to stop, right? I think eventually, absolutely, this is imperative. Internal motivation is imperative. But it's really the job of the addiction professional, it's really the job of the counselor or the therapist to create some internal motivation, right? Like that's the whole point of therapy. That's the whole point of doing treatment, is to create internal motivation, right? And so it's not necessary that the person walks in the door with some sort of internal motivation, right? Like that's why we exist, right? So in fact, folks who have internal motivation and external motivation, when they've done some studies on these, individuals who enter treatment, externally motivated, which means the judge made me be here, my probation officer made me be here, my wife, my mom, my dad, my girlfriend made me be here, right? These and versus the folks who say, I am just sick and tired of being sick and tired and I'm showing up, I'm done, These folks tend to do about the same in regards to treatment, as long as treatment is a significant duration and is at at the right level, right? So as long as treatment is, again, long enough and at the right amount, these folks do the same, right? But the important piece of both of these is that the person has to stop. It's really difficult for anything beneficial really to take place if the person isn't stopping their substance use, right? And it's really important, like, the folks are gonna learn new skills, that's again, these are the two things that we work on in treatment. You work on creating internal motivation, and you work on being able to have new skills to deal with stress, to deal with problems related that happen in life. We talked a little bit about values last week, and substance use does a really good job of separating us from our values, but recovery really helps folks rediscover those values. And this is some of the kind of things that we really work on a lot in outpatient services and inpatient services in our transitional housing facilities, is really creating honesty, being able to deal with difficult feelings without using drugs and alcohol, being able to find new ways to cope with stress. I think stress is the biggest offender for relapse, right? And so being able to deal with stress in a quick and efficient manner is part of being able to recover from a substance use disorder. Taking responsibility, asking for help when you need it, and being of service to other people, listening to other folks, helping out other folks. These are all things that we work on when it comes to recovery. I think that also sometimes there is this feeling of like, once I get into recovery, I want to catch up, right? Because there's a lot of feelings of like, oh, I'm well behind my peers. I haven't got my license yet. I haven't finished school yet. I haven't done this yet. And so there's a lot of like trying to jump back into life a little bit too quickly and overwhelming yourself. So I think it's really important, to deal with the disease first, to deal with skills, to be able to help be in recovery from the disease, and then you start to add on some of the other kind of pieces of, getting back into school, getting back into getting on the football team, getting back into other parts of life. So you should have in your packets risk and protective factors. And I don't want to go through all of the risk and protective factors, but I would like you to kind of look in your packets at some point in time on these risk and protective factors. I think the important thing to say about those is that protective and risk factors are the presence of these factors contribute to the well-being of youth. And really, the important piece isn't necessarily like, I think everybody's going to have some risk factors, whether they be genetic risk factors, whether they be environmental risk factors. And it's not necessarily having the risk factors that's the problem. I think the problem is sometimes not adding in some of the protective factors, not adding in some of the help to be able to deal with those risk factors. The protective factors really lower the likelihood of really long-term negative effects and impacts on the person later on in life, and really help have much better outcomes, even if you are you do have these major risk factors in your life. So anytime you have a risk factor, I think it's important to add in some of those protective factors so that young people can have some resiliency when it comes to dealing with life stress. Okay, real quick, what Dawn Farm does, and what really any not just Dawn Farm, but any treatment facility is going to do. All right, so you have a question: is this misuse? Is this abuse of a substance? The best thing you can do is go get an assessment. At that assessment, one of two things will happen. They will say, yep, you got a diagnosable alcohol or drug problem, or nope, you don't have a diagnosable alcohol or drug problem. If there is no diagnosable alcohol or drug problem, what my suggestions for you would be is, maybe continued parent-family education, coming to something like Teens and Drugs, coming to our Ed series can be really, really helpful. Set consequences, keep enforcing those consequences, monitor the person's use. You're going to see a dramatic decrease, if not complete abstinence from substances. Continue to get education, family counseling, or individual counseling for any sort of mental health needs or any sort of risk factors that you're concerned about, so that way you can add some of those protective factors. Take a wait-and-see approach, and you're probably going to be okay. If there's a diagnosable alcohol or drug problem, what we really encourage people is you got to go to AA. You got to go to AA and NA, or Smart Recovery, some sort of mutual aid program. But we really recommend AA and NA. They have more kind of a robust community. And if you're in the early stages of addiction, early stages of chemical dependency, outpatient therapy plus AA and NA can be really impactful and will help with the person's recovery from drug and alcohol dependence. If you're in kind of the more middle stages, maybe an intensive outpatient treatment plus AA and NA. So intensive outpatient treatment means you got to be in services for at least 9 hours or more per week, plus AA and NA. If you're in kind of the later stages of addiction, inpatient or residential treatment, plus AA and NA is what we would recommend. And in AA and NA, you're going to see a lot of those things as I showed before, which is being able to help deal with feelings, deal with stress, have a community of people that will help you when you, when you ask for what you need. It will be a major boon for social support. But more importantly than anything else, I always like to talk about this particular statistic here. So William White, who literally wrote the book on addiction treatment in America, said that you need 5 years of continuous recovery involvement to produce an 85% probability of remaining sober. Right? So in order for relapse rates to drop below 15% to just get a B here, you need 5 years of continuous recovery involvement. Dawn Farm, even if you're, an adult going through our adult programming, we have a 90-day residential facility. We have a transitional housing care that you can be in for 2 years. We have extended aftercare. We have peer recovery coaches that you can see. And even if you utilize all of those things, you're probably going to get to about 2.5 years of being in services. So we can get you about halfway there, right? So the only thing that probably is going to be able to sustain you for 5 years of continuous recovery involvement is having that same home group, having that same group of people you can go to and see in Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, and that same sponsor you can have for 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years down the road, right? So that's why we really strongly encourage people to get into here, because it creates that ability to be able to be in 5 years of continuous recovery involvement to produce at least an 85% success rate. And options for treatment for families: Al-Anon, Families Anonymous, Nar-Anon, family therapy, structured family recovery. There's something called lovefirst.net that I always like to tell people about. That's the J's website, and they do something called structured family recovery. They also have a lot of information about interventions, and are a really good resource for families. But these are all, Al-Anon, FAN, Nar-Anon, all of those things are also free services that the community offers for folks, for families who are needing support. And I always say that it's, you don't have to wait for your teenager, you don't have to wait for your loved one to be able to get well, for you to get help, for you to be able to find some serenity, for you to find some support. And oftentimes what ends up happening as the family gets support, sometimes the loved one sees this and it creates an environment for them to be able to reach out and get some help too. So. This is the first slide we started out on. So, we talked about this being a model for maturation, for development. When alcohol and drugs get involved, we stop maturing. When recovery gets involved, we start to get back on that chain and we start to mature and develop some of that mastery that we missed when we start using drugs and alcohol. And know that substance use disorders are treatable, and in fact, in this community, it is one of the best communities to recover in, maybe in the country. So there are people all over this city and in this county that are in recovery, and it's a very large and oftentimes hidden population, but you'd be surprised at how many people are in recovery in this community. Here's a little bit more information about help if you need it. I think that you're going to really enjoy our speaker. It's a young person who is in recovery from addiction, and so we'll have everybody join them here in just a second. But I can hang out and answer any questions for folks who maybe have them. And I hope everybody has a great night. Yes, the vaping, yeah. Actually, that's going way up. Yeah, and they actually, I know, Jess, you talk about this, but they've never in the history of monitoring the future seen such a large jump from one year to another. So from 2017 to 2018. Yeah, to 2018, they'd never seen such a large jump in one particular area as they did in vaping. So. Yeah, and the amount of nicotine also in some of these some of these vapes, it's really hard to kind of sometimes even tell. So you're getting like an enormous amount of nicotine in some of these juices than you normally would, creating even kind of greater conditions for dependence on nicotine. And so yeah, and then some people are vaping just juices, some people are vaping nicotine, some people are vaping what is ultimately marijuana that's been stripped. Yeah, so like it's oftentimes it's butane that they're stripping from the marijuana to be able to extract the THC in very kind of high levels. So you're getting like some butane in this THC mix, which is really kind of scary. 2 years ago, nobody ever came in here talking about vapes ever, and every time we have one of these education series, it's the major kind of topic that people are talking about. Yeah. Confronting what you find when you find it, and part of that is like, I think that everybody is, of course, deserving of some privacy and some some autonomy. But when you start to see these things where you're like, hey, I'm seeing bongs, I'm seeing lighters, I'm seeing these very, very dangerous things for you to be using, I think you disrupt their use as much as you possibly can. So like if that means like going in and you keep confiscating things, you keep confiscating lighters, you keep confiscating bags of weed, you keep confiscating oils, you keep confiscating all these things, I think it makes it that much harder to use. And so yeah, I mean, if they keep spending good money after bad on these things that you keep confiscating, and it's keeping their brain sober one more day than it normally would have, I think that's a good thing. And until they have shown some ability to be able to maintain their sobriety, then you can start to be able to like, okay, well let's give a little more leeway, let's give a little more, but you gotta trust and prove it before you can have that trust. Yeah. Love them, hate the behavior, right? And so like, hey, I love you, I'm punishing you because I love you, you know what I mean? And I'm taking this away because I love you and I care about you, and I'm not gonna just let you run rampant. I'm not gonna let you just smoke yourself into oblivion, drink yourself into terrible situations and harm's way, right? I love you, and that's why I'm doing this thing, because I would much rather not be doing this thing, because it's a bigger pain in my butt to enforce this rule. It's a bigger pain in my butt to toss your room and do all this stuff, right? Like, I don't want to be doing this. This is the last thing I want to be doing. I'd rather be binging something on Netflix right now, but here I am doing this, right? And so I'm doing it because I love you. I mean, I think it's okay to be like, hey, this is really frustrating. Like, we could be doing a lot of other things tonight other than this. And then like your behaviors put us in this situation, and here's the consequence for those behaviors, right? This doesn't say anything about my love for you, but at the same time, like, we're not going to keep doing this, If you notice that first slide that I put up there was about 6%. It was looking directly at 12th graders. When I gave my 2018 report, it was 3% because it mixed in the 8th and 10th graders. Of course, I think as you get older, that number is going to increase. But it's still, if you're looking at 8th, 10th, and 12th graders, it's only 3% are daily users of marijuana. It's 12th graders is only not even quite 6%, right? So it's still 94% of the population is not daily using. And so, those folks who are daily using are outliers, right? And probably for a reason that they're daily using, right? And they're probably fitting more into that chemical dependency piece than that misuse or abuse piece. I think if you set and communicate those rules, right? And you say this is the consequence. And if they start using and you start seeing, you start continuously seeing drug use. Now the trick is with marijuana is you're going to want to give them a couple of weeks at least to get it out of their system before you can really kind of say when the last use is. But if you are consistently seeing, a month later, 2 months later, that you're still not seeing clean drug screens, I would say get them to an assessment. Yeah.
Brennan is a young person in recovery from a substance use disorder. And Brennan's going to share his personal recovery story with us now.
Yeah, I feel important with that introduction and this thing. But yeah, my name's Brennan. So I'm 24 years old. And I've been in recovery for over 3.5 years now. I've been clean. And so what that means to me is that it's been 3.5 years without the use of any mind or mood altering substances, including alcohol, marijuana, any drugs. And for someone like me, that's a big deal, because I used to get high every single day. Since I was 15 years old till I got clean at 20. Yeah, and so I guess just a little bit about my background and where I'm from. I'm originally from Indiana. I come from a good family, loving parents, and what I'm sharing is my story and what happened to me. I'm not saying this is going to happen to you, but this is what happened to me. So take it with a grain of salt. Take what you can. I'm not a counselor or anything. I'm just someone here to share with you my story and volunteer, because I sat in these same exact seats at drug groups and all sorts of stuff. So I feel very strongly about speaking with younger people, because a lot of the times people think they can't get clean until they're older, and that's just not true. And I thought that myself. I thought, well, I still got a lot of years left. I got college. I got, thinking I could never stop. And if I did, I wouldn't be able to socialize. I wouldn't be able to have fun. Yeah, so I came from a good family, a supportive family, and so the first time I used was in high school. I was 15, and it was at a friend's parents' wedding, or friend's sister's wedding, and the adults were giving us alcohol, and it just seemed like that's what people did. That's what their family did. They drank. And as growing up, my whole family, they were Irish. They drink a lot, and that's just like it was normal. I do have addiction in my family. My dad's brother passed away from a heroin overdose. And I didn't know about this at the time. This is something I found out when I got clean. But it just seemed normal. That just seemed like what people did. And in high school, smoking pot and drinking and partying, that's what I saw people do. And I wasn't super smart, or I didn't play sports, or I didn't do these things, but I could get high, and that's where I found my where I felt I fit in. And so that's what I did all through high school, getting in trouble. And I got caught the very first time I got high. So, I've never been good at it. But I kept doing it anyway, regardless. Because to me, it was no big deal. I told myself, when I was in high school, I thought I was the shit. You couldn't tell me anything. I was right. You were lame. And I was going to do what I wanted to do. My parents were my enemy. They didn't care about me. They were just trying to control me. And that's how I felt, And so, but I thought, oh, well, it's no big deal. It's a plant. It's natural. Just anything I could tell myself that it was no big deal. And little did I know, what was in store for me later on down the road. But because I didn't know that there was always something different about my using. My friends would always say, it's a weekday, Brennan. Why are you getting high? Calm down a little. Cool it down. And I just thought that's what people did. So there was always something different. Once I stopped, I just kept going. So eventually, in high school, I got suspended. I got in trouble, and later on got expelled, and got arrested. And these consequences just kept building up. And But it didn't matter. Like, I thought I was glad I got suspended, because now I didn't have to go to school and I could just get high. I'm like, I don't know, that's just the way, that's what I was gonna do the rest of my life. Like, when I was in high school, my dream job was to be an accountant for a dispensary. You know, and today I'm in school for accounting, but I'm not gonna be an accountant at a dispensary. But like, that's, my whole world was centered around this, you know. And so things went on, I got arrested, had to do these classes, had to do probation, do all that stuff, and that didn't stop me, you know. I found my way around things. And the day I got off probation, I got pulled over again. Like I said, never been good at it. Always getting caught. And the police officer said to me, he said, he didn't arrest me, but he said, I want to call your mom. I was like, oh no. That's worse than getting arrested, calling my mom. She's gonna really give it to me. And he didn't call her and rat on me. He said, I have your son, you know, and if he doesn't stop doing what he's doing, he's gonna end up with a needle in his arm one day. You know, and that was the most absurd thing I've ever heard in my life when he said that. I said, you are crazy. I will never do that. You don't know me. That's not me. And, you know, like, looking back on it now, how did that guy know, you know? Because of my actions, what I was doing, who I was running around with. And it didn't just happen like overnight. Like when I was smoking weed every day, then like when I'm surrounding myself with those kind of people and doing those things, at least there's other drugs around. Then like, I got to try that. Oh, let me try that. Let me try that. And without even me knowing, like, this is all just happening so fast. And eventually, you know, I was dropped out of school, dropped out of college. Was living with my girlfriend in an apartment. We couldn't pay rent because we spent all our money on drugs. My family wouldn't let me in their house. You know, I had nothing. You know, I wasn't like, I have this image in my mind of what an addict is. It's someone who's homeless, who's begging for change to go buy a beer or something. You know, and that's not what happened to me. But my family didn't turn their back on me, but they kicked me out and they set some boundaries with me. You know, but they also were there to help me. If I asked for help and was serious, they were going to help me, but I didn't want it. And but yeah, so I wasn't that image that I had in my mind. So it was hard for me to realize I had a problem until all this stuff started building up. And eventually, I had to reach out to my parents and ask them for help because I didn't know what else to do. I was tired of living the way I was, stealing from whoever, doing whatever I had to do. You know, there's like a couple of moments that made me want to stop that I remember very vividly, sitting in my car, like thinking to myself, like, what has this come to? How did this happen? How did I get here where I am? And one was like, I was writing checks to my dad, or like out of my dad's checkbook. I was writing checks to myself and just thinking, like, this guy has raised me. He worked so hard for his money, and here I am just ripping it out like it's nothing. And that's like a moment that stuck with me. And there's a few other ones that are not necessarily the most pretty things to share. You know, like, yeah. So eventually I asked for help, and my parents were there. I knew if I asked them, they would help me. And so they sent me to treatment, and you know, they were always trying to help me. And that's what I didn't realize at the time, that what they were doing was to help me, and they cared about me. I thought they were just controlling my life. And so they sent me to treatment, and that's where I got introduced to recovery, to 12-step programs, to finding that people got better, and not everyone got high. You know, like, that was what I was surrounded with, so that's what I thought everyone did. And so when I went to treatment, I learned that, and I remember being like 19 in treatment. I'm like, and there's people that are 50. I'm like, man, this is crazy, you know. And And I remember people telling me like, oh, you're too young. They're like, you know, they're like, oh, I've spilt more beer than you've ever drank. I'm like, well, you need to get a little bit better at it then, you know. I remember people telling me these things like, and me telling myself, well, I still got another 20 years in me. But the reality is, like, the drug that I was using heroin every day. There's a very short lifespan of a heroin addict, you know, especially nowadays with everything. So that's where I was introduced to recovery, 12-step programs. And for the first time, I saw that I didn't have to do that anymore, and I could live a good life. And I met people there who lived in Ann Arbor, and they were young, and they're like, oh, you need to move here. There's a huge community of younger people who are doing this and staying clean and, you know, living a good life. I'm like, okay. And so I had a girlfriend back home, and I remember like, no, I'm not going to go to transitional housing. I'm going to go back and live with my girlfriend. And I remember when my parents picked me up and were driving me to her house, that feeling when I got off the highway, like, I need to leave here. Like, nothing good came. And they say like geographics, like switching where I live or that kind of stuff can't fix my problem, but it definitely helped, you know. Being surrounded by some new people. And so I ended up moving to transitional housing out here, which is, I lived with a couple other guys who were doing the same thing, trying to stay clean and better their lives. And some, you know, I'm 20 years old in this transitional housing. Some of the guys are 40, some are 30, you know, and when it comes to this, age didn't matter. You know, we were all, my roommate now, he's 54, you know. If when I have friends over from school or something, they're like, what? And, you know, but it doesn't, he acts like he's like 20 though. So we get along really good, you know. But I met him in transitional housing. And there I learned how to take care of myself. I learned how to get a job. And I learned how to stay clean. And because before that, I didn't know how to do anything for myself. I always relied on someone else. And, you know, and also attending meetings regularly. They required me to go to meetings. And that's where I found a lot of my support for me. That's what's worked for me, is going to meetings. Because I get to meet other people who have gone what I've gone through and found a way out. And, you know, when I got clean, I thought I was never going to have friends. I wasn't going to have fun. And having a group of people that I can surround myself with, and we have fun and do things, it's just amazing. Yeah, so I guess fast forward for a little bit. I lived in transitional for a year, working at Subway, just doing what I had to do to stay clean. The most important thing was my recovery. That's all I had to do was stay clean. You know, working was second to that. And, you know, and just hanging out and having fun and learning how to be an adult without using. And eventually I moved out of there. Now I live with my roommate. You know, and for me, I guess some of the best things that I've gotten out of my recovery is the relationship with my family. I remember I used to hate my dad. I used to, oh man. We literally got in a fist fight when I was in high school. That's what the relationship was like then. And that wasn't any of his doing, that was all my doing. You know, and now today, like, we're best friends, you know. We're like spitting images. I went home last weekend to visit, actually. They live on the west side of the state. And I just got a new puppy. He's 5 months old and is a little wild thing. But they wanted to meet him, so I went and took him there. And I remember I said something, like, it was a Friday and we were going out to breakfast and the place was packed. And I'm like, don't any of these people work? And your mom's like, that's what your dad says. You know? And, but that, like, and now we talk every day. We're super close. And that's what recovery's given me. You know, and even with my mom and my sister, she's in Kentucky at school. And just being a brother to her and being part of the family again. You know, a lot of the times they think I have the answers to their problems because I'm in recovery and we have a 12-step program, and they'll be going through something and tell me, and they're like, what should I do? I'm like, I don't know. I'm like, I'm not here to solve your problems. But like, for them to call me and ask for my advice, that is insane. You know, and then I started going back to school. You know, I started off at community college when I was in transitional. And I just, who knew that going to class and doing your homework, you would do good? You know, who would imagine? And so eventually then I got accepted to U of M Dearborn. And so now I'm there, going there full time. You know, and something they always told me is, when I got clean, is if you made a list of the things you want in your life, I would sell myself short. And I would have already sold myself short. And this is, you know, I've only been clean for 3.5 years. You know, and being a person in recovery is a core thing of who I am. But not everyone knows. You know, I don't go around school yelling like, hey, I used to shoot heroin, you know, or I don't, in an interview or something, you know. Like they asked me, an interviewer asked me, what's the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my life? And I wanted to say so bad was to quit using drugs. But sometimes it's just not appropriate to share that I'm in recovery. Because that's not who I, you know, that's not who they see. That's how I see myself sometimes. I'm like, I don't deserve that, you know. I don't deserve this job. I'm just a junkie, you know. But that's not who they see. And that's a good feeling. You know, especially applying for jobs right now, I have no experience, so they're hiring me off my character. And to be able to be hired, you know, be proud of who I am today that's awesome. You know, but recovery has just been great. It's been a lot of work, you know, and a lot of trying times, you know, especially being 24, being in college. People always want to go drink and hang out, and you know, like when people that aren't most of my friends are in recovery. So when we hang out, we go to a meeting and we go do something. You know, that's just like what we do. And so like when people from school want to hang out with me, I'm like, what are we gonna do? Like, I don't know what to do with you. But I guess not everyone drinks. I thought, you know, I still had this misconception in my mind that everyone drinks besides me. You know, so we went on this trip to Cincinnati, and it was for a school organization, and they were all talking about, oh, what bar are we going to? And my mind's like, oh, well, you can just go and hang out. Like, just go hang out with them. You don't want to miss out, you know. But that's, and finally decided that I'm not going to go. Like, that's probably not where I should be sitting, feeling alone, you know, right there in front of me, dressed up. You know, my mind tells me, when I use it looks good, and it doesn't, you know. It never turns out well. And so I was like, I'm not going to go. And they're like, oh, why not? I'm like, I don't drink. And they're like, really? Why not? You know, and I don't have to tell them, but I just tell them, you don't want me to. Like, trust me, you'll be leaving me here. You'll be dragging me home. Something's not going to go well. Or I usually tell them it's a lifestyle choice. I just choose not to. But like my mind tells me I'm the only one that doesn't, you know. And then there was a guy in our group who doesn't drink because of his religion. And so we hung out and just watched basketball together. I was like, oh, that's cool, it worked out, you know. But there's just something different about the way my mind works. Once I start, there's no stop. There's no telling when I'm going to stop. I'm either getting locked up or going to treatment or dying, you know, because that's the reality of it. I could. You know, and I never went to jail or anything, and so that was something that kind of hung me up. Like, I've never been in jail, so I'm not really an addict. So now today I volunteer to go into the Washtenaw County Jail and talk to the inmates, because now I can say I've been to jail. But I get let out the same night, so that's pretty sweet. You know, so yeah, my recovery has been great, and it's a lot of work, but you know, I know what's going to happen to me out there. I know what happens. I've proven it to myself time and time again, you know. So and anything can happen when I stay clean, and do what I'm supposed to do, and do my best. And so, yeah, I think that's it. Thanks. So definitely getting expelled made me think, but didn't stop me. Getting arrested made me think, didn't stop me. The things that like really made me stop were like the internal feelings that I had of being like just hopeless. Like the thing with my dad and writing checks, like that wasn't like, no one forced a consequence on me, but that's like how I was feeling inside about what I was doing. Felt terrible. There was things with just that whole lifestyle of dealing with drug dealers and situations like that that really made me question what I'm doing. Yeah, I think really though that feeling of just being beaten down is what finally made me want to change.